repair with critical vehicle function.
Welcome to Future Thinking, episode 136. My name is Alexander Schatten. The title of this episode is Future Brunels, Learning from the Generation that Transformed the World. For my German listeners, this episode is a perfect complement to episode 128, just as a side note. The link will of course be again in the show notes. The first half of the 19th century was a time of remarkable transformation, with England as a major driving force behind changes that improved all aspects of our life. In this episode, I explore the achievements of especially one key figure of this era, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, well known in England, but hardly recognized outside of it, a true shame. I'm confident you'll agree with me by the end of this episode. However, the purpose of this episode isn't just to travel back to the 19th century, but to draw inspiration. What can we learn from this extraordinary generation of engineers and entrepreneurs for our time and the next generation? My guest in this brilliant conversation is Dr. Helen Doe. She's historian, author and lecturer. Her books range from maritime to RAF history. It is people, often the ordinary and sometimes unsung, heroes and heroines that attract her attention. She has published books on the economic and social aspects of Isambard Kingdom Brunel's great ships. The first Atlantic liner featured the story of the passengers and crew on Brunel's first ship, which linked Bristol, Liverpool and New York. This was followed by a book on the SS Great Britain. She has appeared on many Radio 4 programs and on TV. She's a fellow of the University of Exeter, where she previously taught on a range of courses and supervised postgraduates. She's also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and chair of the British Commission for Maritime History. Helen was also for many years a trustee of the SS Great Britain, and in 2018 she was appointed as a member of the Council of Experts for the National Historic Ships, a government advisory body. I personally became aware of Helen when I visited the extraordinary museum in Bristol that shows Isambard Kingdom Brunel's second ship, as mentioned, the SS Great Britain. We will talk about this in our conversation. Now, without further ado, the conversation with Dr. Helen Doe. Helen, thank you so much for taking time for a conversation about, I think, a very interesting and exciting topic, the entrepreneurs of the 19th century, among other things, and the ships they built.
No, it's good to be part of this. It's very exciting.
Maybe just as an introduction, how I came to that topic. I actually researched for my book and for my podcast, let's say, the changes from the 17th to the 20th century, and also the role that England played in that, especially in the 19th century. And in April, I visited England and also Bristol, and it was a bit Brunel themed. So Isambard Kingdom Brunel, we will definitely talk about him today. So my trip was a bit themed by, let's say, Brunel, and I visited several sites that are associated with him, among others, the excellent museum in Bristol where the SS Great Britain is shown. It's a great museum that I can recommend to everyone who visits England. By the way, if you're interested in marine history, I think we're going to talk about this briefly too. Also, the museum in Portsmouth is, I think, very fascinating for everyone who is interested in the topic. Anyway, and at this museum, I also found two of your books. One was about the SS Great Western and the SS Great Britain. And I think these are maybe good examples of the transformation of this time, and we're going to hopefully have an interesting conversation about that. I would just like to start with a line, the title of one of the Brunel biographies, which is The Man Who Built the World. What on earth did Brunel do in the 19th century that he built the world?
Well, I think if we just take his one ship, the ship that remains, the ship you visited, the SS Great Britain, that one ship travelled all the oceans. And you can say that one certainly connected the world. His first big ship, the Great Western, was the first regular steamship across the Atlantic. So made a big improvement in communications between the UK and New York. It shortened communication time considerably. The SS Great Britain, as I said, travelled, although it started originally on the New York run, but it also did Australia, and then went round, in its later years, went round Cape Horn. But his third ship, the Great Eastern, the monster ship, that eventually became a cable-laying ship, and that laid cables in so many oceans, again, improving communications. Communications that would take months sometimes were now reduced to minutes by Brunel's ships.
I think we're going to go a bit more detail about some of the achievements in the ships, but the ships were, when you take Brunel, just one of the many achievements, right? I mean, these were huge achievements, 3 big ships, and then there were other ships as well. Then there was the Thames Tunnel, the first tunnel under a shippable river. I think this is how you call it. His father started this already in the beginning of the 19th century, and then Brunel continued this over his lifetime. Then he made the Great Western Railway. I've written down 1,600 kilometers of railway tracks in the west of England, more than 100 bridges, helping out other entrepreneurs. For instance, I just read the biography of Joseph Paxton, the Crystal Palace, and of course Brunel was involved in that as well.
That's right. Yeah, you've got to remember that he was also involved in so many other railways in different countries. Italy, India. He didn't personally go to those. He sent his own engineers out there, but he was the consulting engineer for railways in other places, which is quite incredible. Also, Calcutta Station was designed by him, India. He had this amazing outreach.
Now, the more general question then would be, what happened, let's say, from the 17th, 18th century to the 19th century that we saw such a breakthrough in transformation, technical transformation, and then a societal transformation, probably driven by the technology. Can you maybe give us an idea what happened over these times?
It was the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. That was what was urging things forward. What we call the commercial revolution began in the 1700s as Britain in particular expanded its contacts in many countries, began to expand its fleet. And after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain's merchant fleet expanded enormously, bringing in raw materials to fuel the Industrial Revolution. And it's from that we then get more and more engineers and people with great commercial and business ideas driving things forward. And Brunel is all part of that. I think Brunel's background's quite interesting because you mentioned his father, Mark. Well, he was French, and Mark left France during the Revolution. He went over to the US, and he was very involved in architecture there. But he met an English woman in France, and he came back to Portsmouth to work with the Navy. And that's where Isambard was born, in Portsmouth. And Mark Brunel then remained in England. But so Mark was a cosmopolitan figure. And what I think is also interesting is that rather than send his son to some school he began in an English school, but his later training was in Paris with a clockmaker, which feels like an odd thing to do. But if you think of the fine engineering involved in complex clock mechanisms, this was great discipline for Isambard. And his father was extremely good about impressing on him the idea of discipline. If you look at Isambard's diaries and his sketchbooks, they are stunning. The detail in them is amazing. And this was all encouraged by his father. So his father, as I say, is quite cosmopolitan, has this big influence on Isambard. So it's slightly unconventional.
Unconventional maybe, but I have the feeling that this was a time of a lot of self-made men and people who really trained themselves to a large extent and then achieved astounding things. As I mentioned, finished the biography of Joseph Paxton, and Joseph Paxton is maybe even more impressive in that sense because he's the, 6th or 7th son or something of a worker. Didn't even have a formal education. I don't know if he learned write and read properly. I don't know. And from this background, he becomes director of many companies, the head of state of Chatsworth, essentially, then was knighted by Queen Victoria, built the crystal. So like these people who clearly felt that they could and also managed to successfully transgress boundaries of the time, no?
I'm not particularly familiar in detail with Paxton. I know little bits about him. You obviously know far more having read the book. But people like Paxton and Brunel, having somebody who was in the establishment, who was your mentor and encouraged you, helped enormously. I mean, in Isambard's case, it was his father. His father was a very well-known engineer by the time Isambard is in his 20s. You know, Mark's been knighted, and that helps Isambard get his job. He works first of all with him on the Thames Tunnel. And the same thing with Paxton, you know, having at Chatsworth, having the Duke of Derbyshire helping you and mentoring you and guiding you in. They're part of this quite small establishment that encourages this. That helps enormously.
That's
They
a very
also
interesting,
speak to each other quite a lot. They speak to each other, they exchange ideas openly.
Can you dwell on that a little bit more? Because the mentoring, I think, is an extremely interesting factor that I didn't consider enough. I think you're right, because Paxton was strongly mentored by the Duke, and then, as you said, Brunel by his father. But this collaboration of there was probably also a big openness even among competitors, because one of the competitors of Brunel was Stephenson, right? And they clearly were economic competitors, because Stephenson built also railways more in the north of England, if I'm not wrong. But nonetheless, they did not block each other out, right?
Yeah, they believed in openly exchanging ideas. Brunel was very anti the idea of patenting. He never patented any of his ideas. He didn't believe. He felt that was locking ideas down. So what he felt, you should have this open exchange of ideas and build on each other's ideas. And that's where he and Stephenson were such great collaborators. It was competitive in the sense that, you know, who actually might get a particular job, but they helped each other. And if there was a problem, I mean, famously, when Brunel has the problem trying to launch the Great Eastern, you know, several of his fellow engineers come to help, because engineers love solving problems, whether it's their own problem or somebody else's. They love solving problems.
So Stephenson came down to help Brunel launch the boat that was stuck in the Thames, right, at the time.
It was stuck. It just didn't move. Because it was such an enormous ship, they had to launch it sideways instead of the conventional stern first. If they'd launched it stern first, it would have become an extremely effective barrier across the Thames. So they couldn't do that. So they had to launch it sideways. And the problem was, with the sheer scale of the ship and friction, it just would not move. And so that's where Stephenson and others got involved.
And that's not the only case, because I mentioned Paxton before, and I also found it fascinating. Paxton built the Crystal Palace for the World Exhibition 1851, and his was only one of many, designs that were sent in for the Crystal Palace. Among others, I wasn't aware of that until these two. Brunel also had an architecture submitted for the World Exhibition, and it was very different from Paxton's, obviously. And Paxton eventually got the order to build his construction. And afterwards, Brunel supported him, even though Brunel did not get his own design, granted, and also helped him later on with the Crystal Palace when he moved it and they built the water towers and so on. So this interaction between all of these people was evidently a very dominating factor.
Yes. They also didn't, I don't think any of them saw themselves as being exclusive in a particular sector of their profession. They were very happy to and enjoyed tackling any problem, which is why you've got this incredible range of things that Brunel is involved in. You know, it begins with a tunnel, then it's railways, then ships. He's involved in docks. He's involved in an early experiments with some sort of gas. We don't know what it was. It was called a gas engine, but we don't know what it was. But it was obviously trying to come up with some kind of propulsion. It was unsuccessful, so it never went anywhere. But he and others, their minds were just so flexible. They just wanted to try out so many new things.
And they were extraordinarily efficient. I mean, you brought, on the last discussion, you mentioned the hospital in Crimea, this extraordinary speed that it came up with the design. Can you tell us a little bit about this hospital? Because it's just a comparatively small thing of his achievement, I think, but it's also very interesting in what short period of time they managed to get things going.
What I love about it is it's, to us, strikingly modern. You know, it really, compare it to an IKEA flat pack. The problem was getting space for hospitals, etc., in Crimea and getting them built. And he came up with something that could be delivered flat and then built on site. It had a lot of clever things in it, like particularly ventilation, good ventilation for the Crimea. He was just so clever in thinking that one through. I mean, it wasn't only the hospital he came up with for the Crimea. I mean, that one was taken on at Renkioi, but he also came up with the idea of a gunboat to be used in the Crimea. In his sketchbooks, there are lots of little drawings of little floating gun batteries that would be almost totally under the water, apart from one small bit that would be the gun turret. The ideas weren't taken up by the Admiralty, but he had these ideas and he pushed them hard. And he got very annoyed because he thought the Navy was very slow in adopting these ideas. He pushed hard to get them used in the Crimea. They weren't, but there they are in his notebooks.
There are a number of very, I feel, modern approaches. One, you mentioned the openness, and that immediately reminded me to, I don't know if you're, accustomed to the term open source, but in software, we have this term open source over like decades. And the idea is that opposed to commercial software where the source code is like hidden and a property of the company, an asset of the company, if you will, open source software is like exactly the same idea. We put it out in the open and everyone can contribute and everyone can in that manner, innovate based on the ideas. Probably Brunel would have been a big fan of open source software in that sense.
Yeah, I think he would. And he probably would have been quite positive about Wikipedia. It's just people building on things. And he and other engineers had that idea. It's later in the 19th century, you get institutes beginning for engineers, institutes for sort of engineers who work on railways, institutes for engineers who work in different sectors. So in a way, it narrows things down as you get further into the 19th century. In Brunel's time, there was none of that. So you were an engineer. As I say, engineers solve problems. Didn't matter what it was, whether it's a flat pack hospital, it's a gunboat or rowing boat. He even had a little drawing of a rowing boat, tiny little boat for his own pleasure. He was just so creative, and his bridges were amazing. If you look at a timeline and add up all of Brunel's projects that he was involved in one way or another, in the 1840s, you wonder how the man ever had any spare time at all, if he did, because there were so many things that he was consulting on, involved in some way. And although he might have sent, as I said, he sent somebody else out, one of his men out to, say, India or Italy or whatever, he was still deeply involved. Again, go back to his notebooks. You see, he was a master of detail, absolutely, and he was over everything.
And we have to imagine, I have a lot of young people who listen to this podcast. We have to imagine this was at a time when you didn't have email, you didn't have WhatsApp, you didn't have, shared document, Dropbox or some such things. So you essentially made your hand drawings or something on paper. And when you wanted to meet someone in the north of England, you probably had to make a day trip or a 2-day trip or whatnot. And so this all was by definition much slower. And then when you think of how these slower times managed to create people like Brunel, Paxton, Stevenson, who it's in such an enormous way productive. It's just, I just cannot get my head around that.
Yes, you're quite right. Let's think about today and the speed of communications. And if you think about what these men gave in the way of improving communications, that you could send something, you send your mail via the railways. Once the railways were expanding, it's so much quicker than sending it via coach. Sending something via a steamship 2 weeks across the Atlantic rather than 6 weeks. Suddenly, all sorts of things become more possible. Later on, you've got cables being laid. Then things are vastly, vastly improved in terms of the speed of information. That doesn't mean to say everybody had access to it, but it is building to the kind of world that we know now.
So I think you make two very interesting comments here. The one is that it's sort of a self-reinforcing loop, if you will. So you build stuff, and that the stuff that you build is then helping the next stuff to be built better or faster, or however you want to call it. That's the one thing. And the second thing is whose life was actually changed by these innovations. But I would like to come to this question a bit later. So you have a sort of a self-reinforcing momentum of technology that really built up in the 19th century. Could we call it like that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Yes. One of my favorite examples of this, the changing speed of technology is during the American Civil War. And obviously that has a lot of impacts commercially, politically, etc. In Britain, you've got the impact on the cotton trade, etc. So speed of information is important. Well, you've got the Great Western coming over from New York with information, with newspapers in there and letters. It travels across the Atlantic. When it gets to Bristol, they rush on board, the journalists and other people rush on board to collect this information. At that stage, there isn't a railway link all the way to Bristol. So they leap on a coach. They travel as fast as they can by coach, writing as they go. Then halfway along, they get on the earliest train they can. The railway line from London to Bristol is about halfway by then. Go into London, and then this information is published in the newspapers. This is before the use of telegraph as well. So you've got this, you can get this physical idea of steam, horse and coach, railway, and the speed of communication. Then, of course, once the telegraph comes into being, when the ship arrives in, say, it'll stop in Ireland, then a lot of this information can go by telegram. But I just love this image of this, they rush on board the ship. The ships come across in 2 weeks. They go the fastest made they can by coach, writing as they do, which must have been hard work in a jolting coach. Then on the railway, which then takes them to their last lap to London, get it into the newspapers, get that information, vitally important commercial information, and also personal information for any friends and family into the newspapers. It's exciting.
It is definitely exciting. And another aspect that also fascinated me about these people and this time is not only because at the moment we focused a bit on the engineering aspect, if you will, or on the also management and technological aspect, but they were not just none of them, not Brunel, not Paxton, none of the other ones, as far as I can tell, were just engineers. Especially Brunel was also a businessman. He tried to finance his project with his own. So he also managed to get the money for this project. And his father, I think those people also took an enormous personal risk in doing that, because his father, as far as I remember, even was bankrupt for a time, I think, and was even in prison or something. So these people also had an enormous personal, they weren't just employed by someone and did it, right?
No, I think there's a slight confusion in there. I never see him as a businessman. He was an independent consulting engineer. With the Great Western Railway, for instance, he was their engineer, employed as an engineer. He wasn't part of the board of directors. He didn't own shares in it. Same thing with the Great Western, same thing with the Great Britain, and the same thing with many of these other projects. He was a consulting engineer. So that was his business, was running his consultancy, and he had people working for him. What is interesting is when the Great Britain has its major disaster, when it becomes lodged on the shore in Ireland, Brunel is prepared to put his own money in to protect it, because that ship to him was so important. But he wasn't part of the Great Western Steamship Company. He was simply their consulting engineer. But he was prepared to put his money in and pay for it whilst the directors were dithering. Later on, with the Great Eastern, he does get totally involved, and he owns part of the company and is putting his money in. So that is the moment when he personally gets involved in the business, but it's at quite a late stage.
But his father, to my knowledge, was very much involved financially in the undertakings, and I think his father, Mark Brunel, was even bankrupt at one point in time, I think.
I'd have to check. I know he went bankrupt at one stage, yes.
Yeah.
But as I said, Isambard Brunel himself, only ever a consulting engineer. And certainly if you look after the Great Britain, he's involved in other shipping involvements with the Australia companies and things. He's shown as their consulting engineer. He's not shown as someone owning shares or being part of the limited company.
Okay, that might be a bit different between different people because Paxton had a lot of shares in various railway companies and was director of various companies. And so maybe there's a difference between different of these engineering characters of the time.
Yeah. He has got a business, his own
Yeah.
consultancy business,
Yeah,
which
sure,
he has
sure.
to
Yeah.
run and make money, and he employs people.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's a different business to actually. So it is interesting that he stays outside most of those businesses until the Great Eastern.
Okay, now we talked so much about the ships because you're a marine historian to a large extent, as far as I understand it, and maybe you could give us a bit of an overview of what an achievement. Because I think the three main ships were the Great Western, the Great Britain, and the Great Eastern. Could you maybe give us a bit of an overview what enormous achievements all of these three ships were in its own right, and maybe also how one led to the other?
The Great Western came about. At the moment we're celebrating, and we're about to celebrate in the UK, 200 years of railways. Brunel was the consulting engineer at quite a young age, in his late 20s, for this new and exciting railway, the Great Western, which was going to be at the time the longest railway in the world. There was a meeting of directors in Bristol, and Brunel said, let's make it longer, which seemed a little bit odd to
Sorry,
the rest of the
it was planned from London to Bristol, right? The
Bristol.
first track.
Yes,
Yeah.
and when it was complete, it
And
would be the
Bristol's in the
longest railway.
west of England, just for people who don't have
Yes, yes,
So yeah.
west of England. So it's almost a straight line east-west across England, and Bristol's then quite an important port. So the idea is that, and I say they are very excited the fact that this is going to be one of the earliest railways, and it's going to be the longest in the world. And Brunel says, why not make it longer? He is such a creative man. He's already thinking, because again, his father knew New York and Washington, having lived there. Brunel's idea is, let's get a ship so passenger can get on in London, travel on the railway, move on to a ship, arrive in New York. And it's one journey, two different forms of transport, but one journey, which is very modern thinking. Today we talk about integrated transport. And so that was the idea, but it was challenged because at the time, marine engines were limited in their efficiency and had to carry so much coal that all the experts said, look, it's not possible to take a ship. The ship couldn't be big enough to take enough coal to get it across the Atlantic. But Brunel was convinced he would. Now, Brunel didn't act totally on his own. He got together a building committee of experts. They examined all the existing steamships, and this is very early days for steamships, and most of the steamships being used just on short runs along the coast or across the Irish Sea.
Or in the US in the US on rivers, as far as I know. No, there were
on the Hudson
boats.
River, the US on the Hudson, they've got a lot of steamships, but they're not efficient enough. And many of the engines, by the way, are coming from England and Scotland in particular. So he then comes up with this idea. They build the Great Western, which in its time is the largest ship in the world, but it's a paddle steamer. It's a wooden paddle steamer.
What does largest mean? What does largest mean? Can you give us a bit of an idea of the dimensions?
The longest, because there were limitations on how long you can build a wooden vessel. Limitations in the technology and the ability of the vessel to because you're having to join the wood. So he builds this, and it's successful. It goes across the Atlantic, highly successful ship, sets up a regular route. You can get backs and forwards between New York and Bristol in 2 weeks. Now, what the company needs to do is to have another ship, because when the Great Western is being maintained, you need another ship. And
we made one point about the technology. This were the technology of the time were paddle boats, right? So they had two. How do you describe it to someone who doesn't know a paddle boat? It's like you have on the side of the boat you have the
wheels.
Propulsion.
Wheels. In the middle of the ship, you have two big wheels either side that move the vessel along by cutting through the water. And that's an important point about the next step in technology. So they aim to build an identical sister ship, but Brunel has other ideas. And the first thing he does, they brought lots of wood, but the first thing he does is says, well, okay, brought lots of wood. Why don't we build it in iron? People were astonished. They didn't think it'd be possible to build a ship that big with iron that would float. There had been small ones that successfully floated, but they couldn't believe it. The advantage of iron was several things. You could build a larger vessel. As I said, with wood, there is a maximum length you can with wood before it sort of bends. With iron, you could build a much larger ship. You could also, it would take greater capacity. With a wooden ship, you had to have a lot of internal strengthening, and the larger the ship, the more the internal strengthening in terms of cross beams, etc. Of course, with metal, you don't need that. So you've got more internal capacity for either passengers or cargo. Brunel also was convinced that it would solve the problem of rats in ships. It didn't, but he was convinced that rats wouldn't board an iron ship. So we still have that problem today. So that's the first change, build it in iron. But they were still going to use paddle wheels either side.
On the second ship that would then become the Great
On the
Britain.
second ship, yes. This is where you've got other ideas developing at the time. You have two engineers playing around with the idea of propellers. Brunel particularly is fascinated by a vessel called the Archimedes, which is a very small one going around Britain showing off this propeller. And Brunel persuades the directors they should totally forget about paddle wheels and use a propeller instead. Now, there's great advantage, especially across the Atlantic. With paddle wheels, if the vessel sort of moves to one side, lists to one side or the other, you're in the middle of the Atlantic with a swell going on, one paddle is likely to be more in the water than the other, so it's less efficient. The other problem you've got is you start off from one side with a shipload of coal. As you're going across, you're using up that coal, and the vessel is getting lighter and coming out of the water. So again, your paddle wheels are not digging in quite so effectively.
So they're losing the efficiency when you get lighter, so to speak.
Yes, because they're not digging in so effectively.
Mm.
So either when it lists to one side or when it comes up in the water. With propeller being underwater, there is none of that problem. So that big change, and it was let's not forget, it was an incredibly expensive change he's asking that company to make. It's not his money, it's their money.
And while the ship was already being built, so it was like in the middle of the build.
They'd already built one engine, so they had to scrap all of that. They'd already had to scrap all the timber. They could sell that on, but they've had to change everything. And it also delays everything as well by 2 more years. So it's unbelievably innovative and is highly successful, very successful. And in fact, the great disaster when the Great Britain gets stuck in Ireland in Dundrum Bay and has to stay there over the winter actually proves how effective iron ships are. Not so much the propeller, but just shows how effective iron is because it managed to survive that disaster where a wooden vessel would have broken up completely.
By the way, this disaster is also very interesting for me because it shows how new designs bring new challenges that you don't expect. And maybe for the listeners, the ships that started from England had to bypass, so to speak, Ireland either on the north route or on the south route, right? And when you went the north route, you went south of the Isle of Isle of Man, and then you essentially went nearly north and then around Ireland. Yes. And as you mentioned, the Great Britain then at one of the tours sort of made quite a massive navigational error and ran into Ireland. Can you maybe explain this? Because this is a very interesting reason why that happened.
Nobody absolutely knows exactly what happened. But my suspicion is that it points to a compass problem with an iron ship. But they didn't want to admit that. The captain at the time, Captain Hoskin, blamed the charts, that there was a faulty chart that showed a navigation light in the wrong place. Now, that man had been traveling that many times, so I just don't believe. The company itself, the Great Western Steamship Company, refused to suggest it was anything to do with the iron. That would have been a disastrous PR. But it is interesting that when the ship was subsequently sold, Great Western Steamship Company went bankrupt. When the ship is sold to the new owners and refurbished, there are all sorts of trials in Liverpool, which is its new home, showing how effective it is in terms of, the compass trials. So they really want to reassure. I think it was the compass was affected by the iron. But nobody is absolutely certain. That's purely a guess on my part.
But nonetheless, it shows. I mean, as you said, this was a very experienced captain. He was not an amateur. He was a very experienced captain. And when I suggest that every listener has a look at the map. And when you see this is quite a substantial navigation error that you maybe an amateur like me would do, but not like an experienced captain generally. Yeah. And it shows that you built a complete new technology, this huge iron ship, and you simply don't have a full understanding what you're getting into, right?
That's right. Hoskin had been the captain of the Great Western for several years. So he'd travelled this route many, many times.
And there is another interesting aspect that I learned at the museum in Bristol about the Great Britain, that I find is also very interesting also for our times, because one engineer or a number of competent engineers is one thing, but you need people who actually built that thing. And what they explained to us at the museum, maybe you can tell us if this was accurate, was that at the time, as you mentioned, there were no big steel ships. There were wooden ships. And you had, of course, a lot of, how do you call them, builders or builders who were quite competent in building wooden ships. And on the other hand, you had people who were quite competent in working with steel, but you didn't have people who were competent in building ships with steel. And so they had to bring together like the shipbuilding experts and the steel, and then they had to build up this competency.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's just, if we, again, just look at all of this, from the engines to the use of iron to the propulsion method. Brunel was constantly testing, trying out things. So with the propeller, do you connect it with chains to the engine or with leather? What's the best method of getting the propulsion from propeller to the engine? And he's trying out all these different ideas all the time. It is mind-blowing, really, if you look at it.
Maybe we should also not forget, this might not be clear to everyone, but this was not a ship that transported, I don't know, cows or wheat or something. It was a ship that they planned for people to travel, and of course it was expensive. So when you had these trips were very expensive, right? So when you had customers who traveled there, you couldn't let them sit on coal sacks, so to speak. So they wanted a certain amount of quality.
And again, he's all over every detail of that, from the Great Western onwards. Steamships were luxury, and so it's luxury travel. Sailing ships weren't, very basic. That's the standard method of traveling across the Atlantic. But right from the beginning, from the Great Western, Brunel's involved in every detail in terms of wallpaper, furniture, paintings used on board, and the same thing with the Great Britain. It's that detailed eye the man has. He understood. He had a very commercial mind. He understood how important it was, the look of it, from the point of the passenger. On the Great Western, they only had one class of passenger, and I rather like this idea. They called them superior class. I think that's a nice phrase. So I think we should use that today. But on the Great Britain, they then went to the more things we're more used to. They had first class and second class passengers. But it still was incredible luxury. We may not think it in terms of small, cramped cabins, etc. But then it was incredible luxury for the time. So they could charge more money and attract the kind of people that wanted to get to and from these places in a hurry.
I mean, luxury also changed. I mean, when I was on the Great Britain, you can go inside and it's really, everyone should go there. It's an amazing ship. But I have to say the cabins from modern standards are very basic and very small, right? Reminded me to the London hotels that are so small that when you open the door, you fall on the bed. So, but nonetheless, it was very luxurious for the time, right?
Very much so. And all steamships are very much promoted along those lines. And with, a lot of, so they had female stewardesses to look after the female passengers. You had a lot of cabin crew and good food on board. The menus are incredible of what they could serve on board.
And one other thing that you mentioned before is the sort of, this was also a marketing issue in a way, because it were the first trips, and many people, of course, were skeptical about, will the ship float? Is it safe? And all of that. And so you wrote in your books that evidently it was quite common at the time that the passengers after the trip wrote like a letter or some statements to the captain or something like that. So like how happy the passengers were after trip, I think was also very
TripAdvisor
important.
reviews.
Sorry again?
TripAdvisor reviews of the day.
TripAdvisor of the 19th century, exactly. So this was also quite important from the marketing point of view, right?
Oh, yes. These sorts of endorsements. Somebody saying how wonderful it was and how fantastic it was. And letters. So letters into the newspapers were very effective as well, because that was a great way of presenting that. And the other thing was to have product endorsements. So you had special champagne from Mum, which was for the SS Great Britain, and other products that were linked to the ship.
The Great Britain, if I remember correctly, not only was the first steel ship, but also they had a fire breaking out, like I think when they left, or was it the Great Western? One of the two
That
ships?
was the Great Western. That was
The
the Great Western.
So, but this, of course, also did not really improve the public trust
Well, see,
into the undertaking.
Yeah, the Great Western is, first of all, experts are saying it can't cross the Atlantic. So the thought is that, that's why it has masts and sails. So if it runs out of coal, it can use the sails. But it's crossing the Atlantic. And then once it's built in Bristol, has to go to London to get the engines, etc., fitted, because that's where the engines are made. Because again, at the time, you've got to remember, just like you were mentioning about few skilled people working in iron, there's a limited number of engineers working on marine engines. So it goes to London to get its engines fitted, and then comes from London to Bristol to pick up its first passengers for its very first, very, very important crossing of the Atlantic. But after it leaves the Thames, a small fire breaks out. What it was just a piece of felt sets on fire in one of the sort of chimneys. And Brunel dashes, this is classic Brunel, he dashes down to help and falls. His great friend, William Claxton, is already down there and below, sorting out the fire. Brunel rushes down the ladder. The ladder has got slightly burnt, and he falls and lands on top of Claxton, who breaks his fall. But Brunel is badly bruised, badly injured. So two things happen. One, obviously, that puts off some of the passengers who've booked. They're going, oh, my goodness me, the steamships are dangerous, aren't they? And two, Brunel never gets to go on his ship across the Atlantic, which is a great shame. He was planning to go. He doesn't get to go on that great journey.
And also you mentioned another thing which I found very fascinating, because you see like how confident or also what risks these people took on, because you mentioned that there is this character, Professor Larda, or Dr. Larda, I think, or Lardner is his name, I think. And he was one of these experts that you mentioned who, as far as I understand, toured through London and explained everyone who wanted to listen that this ship is never going to work, whilst Brunel built the ship and tried to keep his financiers happy, right? Someone runs around and tells this is never going to work.
And Lardner's part of a group of very influential scientists. Lardner's Irish. He's part of this influential group of scientists that travel around the country having meetings. He's saying it's just not technically possible. Brunel says nonsense it is, and proves it is possible. Lardner is quite interesting. Lardner had a rather romantic disposition and ran off twice with other people's wives, and then ended up in New York, rather disgraced because of this habit of running off with other people's wives, and really loses his way. He ends up having to give lectures to try and pay his way.
Yeah, but you see, experts sometimes are quite wrong, and the engineers got it right in the end. In that case, so the Great Western, in that sense, was a very successful ship, right? It was also commercially successful, and the Great Eastern then was technologically a big success, but not so much economically, right?
And I think the pity is that generally people tend to have this view that Brunel was not commercially successful as a businessman. But as I explained, he wasn't a businessman. He wasn't a director. He wasn't a director of the companies. But the Great Western was highly successful. It's a forgotten ship. And the Great Western is paying for the Great Britain to be built with all these changes. So thank you, Great Western. Without that, the success of that, we wouldn't have had the Great Britain. And it is the disaster, the navigational disaster, that causes the collapse of the Great Western Steamship Company. The Great Eastern, on the other hand, the one company that Brunel personally gets involved in, is not a commercial success. It is a cul-de-sac. It's a sort of dead end in engineering. It has both propeller and paddle wheels. And it is so big. It is a monster ship in all sorts of ways. It never, ever fulfills its promise of carrying vast numbers of passengers. It never does, but becomes unexpectedly wonderfully successful at laying cables, which in fact Brunel did foresee. Again, we go back to his amazing notebooks, and Brunel is actually drawing at one stage. Let's remember, by the time the Great Eastern becomes a cable-laying ship, Brunel's dead. But before the Great Eastern happens, Brunel in his notebooks has drawings of a cable-laying ship.
And cable laying, just to be clear for the listeners, cable laying means, like, for instance, you put telegraph cables or something from, let's say, the US to England or something like that, right?
Yes, it was initially from Ireland as the nearest point, Southern Ireland, to the US. So it's a physical cable, as we still have today, across, and then you can send something via telegraph. It doesn't instantly speed up communications for everybody, because if you think about it, you've just got one cable going from one point in one country to one point in another country. You still need the distribution methods, which may be by pony at the other end, or might be telegraph. Just depends how well you've got things set up.
And maybe I just wrote it down. I found it just interesting to see how the dimensions changed. The Great Western, so the first ship, had about 2,300 tons of displacement, if my number is correct. The Great Britain then had about 3,500 tons of displacement, and the Great Eastern about 30,000 tons. So it was like a dramatic. Each ship was always like massively outpacing the previous one.
And if we just look simply at length, the Great Eastern, when it is launched, is the longest ship in the world until about 1890. So there isn't another ship longer than it until about 1890. I may have that date slightly wrong, but as late as that, certainly not until the last decade or so of the 19th century.
And there's another very fascinating, how should I say, perspective on the 19th century. Because as you mentioned, these ships were clearly, how would you say, luxury items, if you will, in the beginning, at least from the passenger point of view. So what my feeling is about the 19th century is that, as someone said, as the other biographer said, the man who built the world, I think they created a lot of technology, from railways to electricity to telegraph to shipping to, I don't know, what have you, canals. I don't know how do you say, like wastewater. How do you say, after the cholera?
Drains
drains. Yeah, yes. Yeah, exactly.
Drains. This drainage system in London.
Exactly.
Basil jet.
Yeah, exactly. So this sort of thing. So, but the point was, like, in the beginning, it was clearly something. Also, the railway, I think, was clearly something for the wealthy to take the train. The innovation started, but like the quality of living for the average persons in the beginning was not much affected, I think. But then, over the time of the 19th century, that changed significantly, right?
Yes. I always find it fascinating that a new technology comes along, and sometimes the inventor of that technology thinks, oh, this is going to be the best thing since sliced bread. But people adapt and use it sometimes in a quite different way. Like texting, for instance. It was just there as a kind of free idea, but it's discovered and suddenly people use it and it explodes. So sometimes the inventor doesn't always know how powerful their invention is and in what way human beings will use it. And that, I think, for me, is always very interesting.
That's super fascinating. Another example that comes to my mind, because I researched it also recently, was, I forgot the names and the dates, but it must have been in the 1880s, I think, the first electrical installations in England. I forgot who it was, but the first applications of electricity was once a theater in London, I think, and the second one was the private home of this inventor who built the bulbs and electricity. Okay, but the interesting part was that the person who invented that had no idea if this would have any significant impact. I mean, today we say electricity, to just contemplate that we don't have electricity is like outrageous. But he was not sure. He thought, okay, maybe it's like a party trick for a theater or something, but will this scale? So they really didn't have the idea that it is the most transformational invention of humanity, electricity, right?
And then you can have other things which the inventor or creator thinks is going to transform things and doesn't, like the Great Eastern. That is a dead end in technology.
although you could say that maybe the Great Eastern per se was not, but the idea to have this scale of ships clearly was successful as an idea, no, not as the ship per se, no?
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. But again, that shows Brunel's ability to think large scale. Although he could work on the tiniest of things, as I was discussing about looking at the interior decoration and things on the ships, he also had this incredibly world view of things. One of the things that's often forgotten, or it's really overlooked, because it's almost a sentence or two in his son's biography. Isambard Brunel's son wrote the biography in later years. And in there, he mentions briefly that his father built 2 ships for Australia. People tend to forget that. These 2 ships, this was before the Great Eastern. We've got communications improved across the Atlantic, communications improved across the Indian Ocean, India, but what we haven't got is good communications with Australia. This is the most furthest outpost. The government's interested in mail ships, getting good regular communication through mail dispatches. And Brunel actually is involved together with Scott Russell, with whom he famously fell out on the Great Eastern. So before the Great Eastern falling out, the 2 of them make a very successful partnership with 2 ships, one called the Victoria, one called the Adelaide, which are designed specifically as steamships for the mail run to Australia. And they're mentioned, I say, briefly by Isambard's son, but digging around a bit, that's fascinating. One of them was successful, one of them was very unsuccessful. And these 2 as well so Brunel's ships actually end up in the Crimean War. So he's involved with hospital there. He's drawing gunboats. But of course, as the Crimean War goes on, they need to take more men, equipment, etc., to and from the Crimea. So the government, the Admiralty, calls up the mail ships, which are commercial vessels carrying official mail. And so the Great Britain is called up for Crimean duty. So is the Great Western, but so too, and generally people haven't really known this, are the Victoria and the Melbourne also. So in the Crimean, 4 of Brunel's ships are involved in the Crimean War at the same time.
And maybe we could also extend the influence. As I mentioned before, I was also in Portsmouth, and Portsmouth is an extraordinary, well-made maritime museum, in my opinion. And there you see the HMS Victory and also the HMS Warrior. And I think if you see the HMS Warrior, which must have been built in the 1850s, 1860s, something like that, was essentially also, I think, learning from Brunel's experiments, no?
Brunel was involved with the Admiralty in very early propeller trials. The Rattler was the ship that he persuaded them to get built. This is at the same time he's working on the Great Britain. So he's very clever in this. He's got the Admiralty running trials on propellers, different kinds of propellers. And he's also doing his own experiments on propellers with the Great Britain. And so there's a lot of learning going between the 2. So the Rattler can be attributed to Brunel also.
And all of that, we haven't even mentioned that, but all of that, despite the fact that Brunel unfortunately died relatively young, he died in his early 50s, I think, probably because his lifestyle and other health issues that they couldn't treat at the time.
Bright's disease. And interestingly enough, his close friend and rival, Stevenson, dies of the same thing not long afterwards. If you think about it, it may have been part of their occupational hazard. They were always experimenting with things, whether that had an impact on them. But yes, he died very young, probably with the sheer scale of things he was involved in, I suspect. From the Royal Albert Bridge, the bridge over the Thames between Devon and Cornwall in the West Country here. You've got bridges across the Thames. You've got a bridge he built for Queen Victoria in Balmoral, her estate in Scotland, which, by the way, she wasn't very impressed with. She thought it was a bit too utilitarian in design. You've got station buildings, railways, docks. He's incredible. I think he would have died of overwork anyway.
I was just joking with a friend recently. I said if Brunel got 80, maybe he would have made the first satellites. Who knows?
No.
But anyway, so that's all highly fascinating. But there is one also an aspect. We talked about a lot of the, I don't know, the collaboration of the people, the openness, all of these things that we talked in the beginning. And I have the feeling there's a lot we could learn still today. It's not just an historically interesting time, but my feeling is that we could learn a lot today from this generation of entrepreneurs, of engineers, of inventors. And I don't know, in one of the Brunel biographies, the author wrote, in one of the last sentences was, quotation, "Could our society produce another Brunel? It is difficult to see how." And I found this actually very frustrating, actually, very depressing. Why on earth would our society today not be able, I don't know what your opinion is, but the opinion of this author was that our time would not be able to create such characters anymore. Do you think we can learn something from this period of time, from these people?
I don't feel that negative about it. I think it depends. It goes down to definitions. How do you define Brunel and define him in terms of his context? We have some brilliant inventors today who've come up with some amazing ideas. Let's look at Tim Berners-Lee, and we wouldn't have the internet without him. And commercial people. I mean, Richard Branson. There's an amazing man who's involved in so many different organizations and companies across a whole range of things. Perhaps he's got one particular idea, but he takes it across any kind of product, any kind of market. So there are people around, and I'm sure you've got some examples where you are. I don't feel quite so negative about that. I think there's a lot of innovation going on, and long may it continue. We need it.
However, we see this in detail, but for me personally, looking at the 19th century and these people, for me, it is very inspirational. I think what these people managed to do because when you build an airport today, like people fail to make an airport in Berlin, right? In time and in money. And this is the 10,000th airport that was, or whatever in the world. It's not like, oh, we built the first airport on the planet, No, I mean, airfield or whatever, airport anyway. But these people built the first of its kind and managed to drive things forward. And I find this highly inspirational, and I hope we can learn a little bit from their ethos, from their productivity, from their mindset. That is sort of why I'm so interested in this time.
I had the great privilege last weekend of speaking to the son of Frank Whittle, the man who invented the jet engine. It's amazing. So you think of the technology and the technological ideas and the sheer range of ideas that came out through necessity in the Second World War. These ideas are all around and continue to expand. The space program has brought out all sorts of things that we now use and take for granted, not realizing that it was the space program that was the innovator. Brunel would have liked the space program.
I'm sure he would. I'm quite sure he would. And probably would be the first one who makes touristic space travel to moon, I don't know, or something like that. extend the Great Western from Bristol to a moon station or something like that.
Oh yeah, he'd be on it.
I find it fascinating. Thank you so much for this conversation. I just want to take this. On the one hand, I think this time is extraordinarily fascinating. On the other hand, I just like also the positive vibe that you also conveyed here. And I think that we should take these people as an inspiration of what we might still be able to achieve, no?
And one of the wonderful things that the museum in Bristol does is it has a program called Junior Brunels. It goes to the local schools, particularly the schools in less affluent areas, and takes boys and girls, young boys and girls who are interested possibly in engineering, and through Brunel's inspiration, Future Brunels, that's what the program's called, let's get it right, Future Brunels, and just gets Brunel and his ideas to inspire them to possibly go into scientific or engineering occupations or engineering kind of work. And that's a lovely idea. So it's a great way. They can only do small numbers at a time. But it really is inspiring that younger generation through Brunel and linking today. And I think that's great.
That's a fascinating, great idea. And I would really like to end it with this because this is a very positive outlook. Maybe we can not only make future Brunels, but maybe we can in Germany, in Austria, or whatever country you are in, just pick up this type of idea and inspire future, I don't know, whatever name you would put behind that,
whatever.
Right?
It's wonderful. Yes.
Wonderful.
So using the past to inspire the young of the future.
Helen, thank you so much for this terrific conversations. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much.